So it is happening. President Trump and President Putin are going to speak on Tuesday. That is following that proposal for a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. And President Trump has said they're going to talk about land and power plants.
So what does that mean for the future of Ukraine? Well, that is what we're going to be discussing on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast.
Hello, it's Alex in the studio.
And it's James in the studio.
So we've had another couple of days where there have been a lot of conversations about Ukraine and about the future of Ukraine. And we learnt on Sunday night, early hours of Monday morning, that there's going to be one big conversation that could be really, really significant between President Trump and President Putin. And this is the second time that these two have spoken, and an awful lot has changed since the first time they had a conversation.
The big thing that's changed, of course, is that there is this potential 30-day ceasefire proposal now on the table. The United States has put that to Ukraine. Ukraine has said it accepts it. And now what will Russia do in response? But even then, even if that is accepted, there's lots of other questions about what a ceasefire might look like and what might happen beyond those 30 days.
And we can talk about all of this now with James Landale, our diplomatic correspondent, who is actually in Kyiv for us.
Hi, James.
Hey, how are you?
Very well, very well. Thank you for joining us. I know you're very, very busy in Kyiv. Now, before we get into any detail about what Trump and Putin might discuss, what's your sense, James, of this call taking place at all? Is this a surprise or something we expected to happen?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is that normally in diplomacy, when you have two leaders coming together, it's normally at the end of a process. It's to sort of get a deal over the line. It's just when you're sort of dotting some T's and crossing some dotting I's and crossing T's, and to get a deal finally done. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think what's happening here is an attempt by the Americans just to maintain the momentum and the pressure on Vladimir Putin. If you think about it, it's now just over a month since I think the two presidents last spoke from the original call that was an hour and a half long. And I think that last week, you had Mr. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff's meeting Mr. Putin in Moscow. Then you had diplomatic contacts between the Russians and the Americans over the weekend. And I think they now want to just keep that pressure going because they know that at the moment, Mr. Putin has said yes in principle, but no in detail, because he has lots of terms, conditions, questions about detail and substance before he's going to go anywhere near signing any kind of a deal. So I think they don't want this just to sort of grind into the sand. They want to keep it going. And I think that's why they've decided to deploy the president to make this telephone call.
And it's really interesting because we heard a little bit from President Trump when he did one of those kind of huddles on Air Force One on his plane with all the reporters gathered round. And obviously people were asking him, what do you reckon you're going to say to President Putin? And we can actually hear a little bit of it now, but you will hear all the sort of plane noise in the background. It's pretty noisy, but this was President Trump talking ahead of that phone call.
I think we'll, be talking about land. It's a lot of land. It's a lot different than it was before the wars, And we'll be talking about land. We'll be talking about power plants. That's a big question.
So you can hear most of it, but effectively, James, what he was saying is I think we'll be talking about land. I think we'll be talking about power plants. When he says talking about land, what do you take that he means from that? Is he talking about, the divvying up of territory in the long term, or is it something completely different?
Well, the honest truth is we don't know what he means by that, but there are some indications. I think the first thing is it's unlikely to be fundamental principles of, who is going to have what at the end of this process. We're not talking about major, land for peace deals, all of that, because both sides are frankly on other ends of the spectrums. The Ukrainians have made it very clear that they are never going to accept any territory occupied by Russian as Russian, and the Russians have made it very clear that constitutionally the four regions of eastern Ukraine that are partially occupied are in wholly constitutionally Russia, and they're not going to move from that position. So the expectation is that a part of this deal, potentially in the long run, the sort of territory will just almost be parked, put to one side and say, look, that's something we'll deal with later. I think what their negotiators are looking at the moment are the more immediate issues. President Zelensky was talking about this over the weekend. It's kind of, if you're drawing up a ceasefire, you've got to draw up a ceasefire line or a contact line, or call it what you will. Now, in the open, that's a pretty easy thing to do. It's just, a field or a forest or something. But if the current front line bisects a town or a village, then it gets hard. So you've got to kind of finesse those kind of details. The second thing he mentioned was an energy plant. And what he's referring to there is the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. That is Europe's largest nuclear power plant. It's in occupied territory, Russian territory at the moment. And essentially what the Ukrainians are talking about there is, look, they want to have that back. But it's not as easy as you might think, because it's not just a power plant sort of stuck out of nowhere. It's right by some water. It's got a town next to it where all the workers live. So in other words, it's a complicated piece of territorial real estate, if you like, that would have to be resolved. And what, the President has referred to it, Steve Witkoff has said that it's come up in conversations. So it's clearly something that is being discussed at the moment. Whether it's resolved as part of any kind of 30-day deal remains to be seen. The third item that they're talking about is some kind of deal involving the Black Sea, ensuring safe access to some Black Sea ports. So those are the details that they're looking at. But the substance, we simply don't know the detail yet.
Previously, in public, and we assume also, or it is certainly reported in private, President Trump has leant towards Vladimir Putin, James, in a way that's extraordinary for an American president, and in a manner that we've never seen in our lifetimes before. Where, given that, do you think the balance of power in these negotiations lies?
Well, it's a really good question. And the honest truth is we don't know the answer to that yet, because we haven't seen both sides deploy their power. So Vladimir Putin has said yes, but no, here are my terms and conditions that he spelt out during that press conference with the president of Belarus last week. So he set out his for the first time, since we started all of this entire process well over a month ago, we've actually now have some Russian terms and conditions and questions on the table. But what we haven't seen yet is how hard President Putin is going to defend those positions. Where is he going to move, if at all? There are many European leaders who are very sceptical because they think that he has nothing to lose at the moment, and he wishes this conflict to continue because he's making some gains in the east. And he certainly wants to not agree anything until he's thrown every single Ukrainian troop possible out of the Kursk region of Russia, where Ukraine invaded 8 months ago. So that's the Russian side. On the American side, we do not know how much hardball Mr. Trump is prepared to play. Is he prepared to increase sanctions on Russia? Is he prepared to increase sanctions that are secondary sanctions on all those countries that are helping Russia get around the primary sanctions by allowing, by selling on some Russian oil, or by allowing goods to trade through their borders? And also, is Mr. Trump prepared to step up military aid to Ukraine? That is a clear, the United States has huge inventory of kit that it could give to Ukraine to help it prosecute its war against Russia. That is still an option. We don't know if he's prepared to do that. Or, as some Ukrainians fear, do they fear that Mr. Trump, in his effort and enthusiasm to get a quick deal, starts selling some of the shop and making too many concessions? Whether they are economic or whether they are Ukraine-focused, we don't know. So, in other words, in answer to your question, who's got the balance of power here? We don't know, because they haven't demonstrated that power yet.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, it has occurred to me that it seems more likely that Donald Trump's going to say to Volodymyr Zelensky, look, President Putin's put a deal on the table. Whatever is in that deal, take it or leave it. I don't know, Alex, what are you thinking?
I think what strikes me about the whole thing is that you've got these kind of like different track approaches happening at the moment. So obviously we have got this dialogue, and we will hear more following a phone call between President Trump and President Putin on Tuesday. But you've then got all of the other conversations that happen between the EU leaders and then with Keir Starmer, where they are doing what they see as their bit in attempting to strengthen Ukraine's hand ahead of the dialogue that's happening between President Trump and President Putin. And presumably, James, all of this is at some point going to have to come together. And I don't know, how do you see that unfolding, where you've got very clear positioning from the EU leaders and Keir Starmer on one hand, and then this different tack and approach from President Trump to President Putin on the other?
Well, again, a lot of that depends on where the Americans and the Russians end up. I think what the Europeans are trying to do at the moment is basically to get all their ducks in a row, get as prepared as they possibly can for that moment, if it comes, of a ceasefire being agreed, so that they can wade in as soon as possible to give as much support to Ukraine as they possibly can. And some of that is, it's not military stuff as well. It's about, making sure that insurance companies are ready and prepared for that moment when the airlines say, hey, when can we start flying commercial airlines into Ukraine again, and seeing what do the civil aviation people say about that? What do the insurance companies say about that? That's where the EU and other countries can play a real role, I think. In terms of the sort of military reassurance force that's being considered at the moment by the so-called coalition of the willing, that is primarily targeted at the Americans. It's to say, look, this is what Europe is offering. This is the detail. This is how comprehensive we're going to be. All we need is a little extra help from the United States, to give us the sort of, the icing on the top of the cake, to give us a little bit of a backstop, air cover. But that request from the Europeans, I think, it will come very, very close to the end of the process. It's not going to happen now, because they know that the moment they go to the United States and start asking for air cover, the response back is, oh, whinging Europeans, you're not pulling your weight. So the Europeans at the moment are saying, right, what have we got? That's why there are going to be military discussions amongst military chiefs in London on Thursday, is just to make sure that every country can say, right, we're providing boots on the ground, we're providing logistics, we're providing intelligence, we are providing some jet air cover, all of that sort of stuff. And then it's logistical stuff. Where are they going to be based? How long are they going to be based there? What's the resupply going to be? All of that takes a degree of time to plan.
It's so interesting. And actually, I should say, because exactly as you say, James, those conversations took place over the weekend. There's going to be further conversations about possible contributions from EU countries and others during the course of the week. And number 10, on a Monday morning, they have the briefing with all of the lobby journalists in Westminster. And there were lines that came out from Downing Street spokesperson about this. And they were saying, we expect more than 30 countries to be involved, a significant number of them willing to contribute troops. But it's not just about troops, exactly to the point that James is making. Other countries might offer jets, others might provide the engineering support. So it's all this kind of attempt to show we've got a lot of people on board with this. But James, just one other thing that struck me is that, am I right in saying that this is the first time that you've been back in Kyiv since President Trump and President Putin had that initial phone call, which really seemed to kind of change the dynamic in this war? And if that's the case, I'm just wondering, what is your sense of how people in Ukraine are feeling at this point, watching all of these conversations go on, conversations about their fate and their future? Have you sensed a bit of a shift in the feeling, in the mood in Kyiv this time around from when you were there previously?
Look, I think the leadership now recognised, that the world has changed. I think that one of the causes of that bust-up between Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Trump in the Oval Office was a sense that the Ukrainians were still slightly, in pre-Trump mode, and the Americans felt that the Ukrainians hadn't quite woken up to the fact that, the world had changed. Donald Trump is going to do things. So I think there's a sense of, OK, Donald Trump might be presenting some options here. He's changed the dynamic. But there is, I think, a certain degree of nervousness about what it might mean, because there's so much uncertainty. Nobody knows how this is going to pan out. There's not a huge amount of trust, I think. If you talk to Ukrainians and you read the Ukrainian press, they do not think war is about to end soon. They are prepared for the long haul. I read a piece this morning about Ukrainian recruits who are still, learning, civilians who are sort of learning basic military drill because they know at some point in the future they are likely to have to use it. So there's a sense of that taking place. But equally, remember, we are 3 years into war here, and so inevitably there is a degree of exhaustion and tiredness about the fact that this has been going on for so long. But I think I primarily characterise it as just a slight sense of apprehension, but simply because there's a huge uncertainty about where this is going to end up. But they do not think, they do not share the automatic positivity of the Americans because they have less trust, I think, in the Russian side.
And James, so very briefly, and it's a horrible question to ask you very briefly, do people there, though, feel that on the battlefield, Ukraine is losing this war?
It totally depends who you speak to, but you get different opinions. There are those who have suffered grievously, and are fed up and they just want it all to end. There are those who think, look, yes, Ukraine is losing ground in the Kursk region where it had occupied part of Russia, but at the same time, the front line in the east is actually remarkably stable. I mean, Russia is gaining very, very little territory incrementally. Last year, I think the figure is last year, Russia gained 0.5% of Ukraine's territory, and it cost them, 400,000 casualties. The head of Ukraine's army said earlier last week that already this year, Russia has suffered 100,000 casualties. So that's, wounded and killed. Now, there's no way we can check those numbers at all. But even if it's half that, that is still a phenomenal number of people who are dying to make very, very incremental gains. And so strategically, Vladimir Putin has not achieved his aim at the moment of defeating Ukraine, cowing Ukraine, seizing it, imposing his own pro-Putin, pro-Russian government here. This is a country that is still very vibrant, dynamic, determined to protect its sovereignty and its integrity. And I think that, so do people think we are losing the war? No, I think they feel that they are fighting a war. It's tough. They are losing some ground, but they are also, they think, holding their own. And all is not as bleak as some might think.
James, we know you've got to run. Thank you so much for your time. Really good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great to chat.
So there's a big challenge, a big moment coming up for the UK government on Tuesday when we expect ministers to set out much discussed changes to benefits, to the welfare system. There has been a lot of noise about this in the run-up, and now we're getting close, Alex, to seeing what they're going to do. Yeah, because we've talked about it on Newscast quite a lot. It's been a very well-trailed thing that effectively they want to bring down the welfare bill. And there is a lot of noise about it. There's a lot of politics about this, particularly within the Labour Party. It's going to be really significant when we finally get the detail from the Work and Pensions Secretary, Liz Kendall, which we're expecting on Tuesday. And I think the political fallout will be really significant. But before we get to all that, we thought it might just be helpful to talk through what are the things they're looking at? What is it that the government is trying to achieve here? And to do that, we've got Faisal Islam. Hello.
Hello.
Who's just written a really in-depth, good piece on the BBC News website, which is looking at all of this, which is looking at where the government's coming from, who they might choose to look at, how they might go about getting the welfare bill down, and crucially, how it's gone up so much in the first place, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are two sort of related but distinct kind of motivations at play here. And they need not be inconsistent, but they might be. And let me explain why. So you have, as you mentioned, the need to save money, essentially to hit Rachel Reeves' borrowing targets at the spring statement next week. And the famous headroom, the room for manoeuvre against her targets, has essentially been wiped out by changes in interest rates and changes in growth rates around the world, but also pertaining to the UK as well. So they've had to find some money. And so that is one, if you like, motivation. But the other motivation is to reform what they're calling a broken system. And I think it's pretty clear from the numbers that something significant has changed. You could date that, at first glance, you could date that to the pandemic, a significant increase in two types of claimant of disability and health-related benefits, which have really shot up. So you're talking musculoskeletal, back problem is the biggest example of that. That's mainly at the older age, but it's also a consequence of, for example, state pension age going up. Tens of thousands of the people that would have otherwise got pensions just ended up claiming some form of health benefit. But more worrying, perhaps, well, definitely more worrying in terms of the economics, is at the younger end, seeing mental health and behavioural problems for which people can claim benefits. They have absolutely sort of ballooned. You've got something like hundreds of thousands more, and they obviously particularly affect younger people. So that's if you like, there are two problems there. Now, if you solved the latter problem, you would get your savings, right? That's what I mean. They're not necessarily they're consistent. But if you want to book certain savings in your accounts for next week, then you won't be able to rely on that. So there's a big sort of philosophical, political question about, is it really about reform or is it really about savings?
So, Faisal, without bogging newscasters down in too many statistics, I've pulled a couple of stats out of your really interesting piece that you've written, as Alex was saying, for the website. And let me just throw these out there, because the scale of the change and the pace of the change in people claiming particularly these two benefits, disability benefit, sometimes known as PEP in England and Wales anyway, and incapacity benefit, which supplements income for someone whose health limits their ability to work. The change is really dramatic, isn't it? So if we look at 2002, the number of working age adults in England and Wales claiming disability benefits for mental or behavioural conditions was 360,000 people. 2002, 360,000. Last year, 1.28 million. And then if we skip forward, and I promise this is the only other statistic I'm going to do for now, because I think we need to drip feed the stats. In 2019, according to the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the number of people, again in England and Wales, on disability or incapacity benefits was 2.8 million. That is 1 in 13. And in 2024, that was 4 million. Or 1 in 10. Now, that's overall disability and incapacity. That's a bigger number. The first number was just for people with specifically mental health or behavioural conditions. Whatever way you cut it, these are dramatic, huge increases and enormously costly for the government.
Yes, they're enormously costly. And then they're not just enormously costly in terms of the fiscal cost, like the cost to the exchequer, to the taxpayer. In terms of the lost work you'd expect, particularly from the younger cohort you've described, that is really bad for the economy.
And for the individual.
And it's terrible for the individual too. So it's like a lose, lose, lose. And so definitively, it's a win-win-win if you can solve it. But, you know, if it was easily done, it would have been done already. And so you then have this situation where it is, in order to get the win-win-win, in the past you've needed to invest some money to help the challenge. You know, there are challenges there, and in order to get them into the workforce, you need some help. And in particular, and it is, you know, we've had some of these trends in all developed countries in terms of increases in mental health. We haven't had quite the increase in inactivity that's been seen in the UK. That rather suggests that there may be something in policy that is causing a problem. Now, this is we haven't proven this point, but, you know, it raises questions. Now, my understanding of the internal thinking in government is that they pin things on the reforms in 2017, which were controversial in and of themselves. It led to the resignation of Ian Duncan-Smith and all this stuff. But essentially, you have three buckets of workers, and there was a middle ground of people who might not be able to work full time, who were given some subsidy and help to get back into work. That middle ground was shrunk. And then those people who could claim that they were sort of unable to work couldn't just claim the benefit, but that benefit went up with inflation. Everything else was frozen in cash terms. So in the system, you have a big incentive, either a sort of Y junction, to work or to claim that you can't work. And part of the test of these sets of reforms in the Green Paper will be, do they sort of break that binary system? Do they encourage this middle ground to some degree? That is what to look out for. They're saying that that's what they want to do. If it turns out there's only a token amount for that, you know, I don't know what the policy is going to be, but we'll be able to start to judge this by tomorrow. I think that's a key test as to whether this is just merely about cost savings, or is it actually actually genuine reform.
It's so interesting because obviously the government's been talking about this for quite a long time, and a lot of the reason they put forward as their justification for wanting to look at this is because they do see, exactly as Faisal says, a really particular problem with working age people and the number of working age people who are now claiming these health and disability benefits, right? And so what they are arguing is they think there is a kind of moral case as well as an economic case to help these people back into the workplace. But when it comes to how you go about doing that, there's different schools of thought. And there are some people, including some people within the department, who genuinely think that you have to get the investment, as Faisal says, to get the support systems in place to get these people back into the workforce. And whether that means, and the government will point to some of the pilot programmes that it's done around this with work coaches or other pilot schemes where they say they're expanding the support, working with people to try and get them back into the workplace. But there are some people that say it's actually bigger than that. It is about the support that employers can offer people. It is around the arrangements or adaptations that employers might need to make to help people who are currently on these benefits back into the workforce. It is about transport infrastructure. It is about housing, and all of that stuff comes
NHS
with an investment.
lists.
NHS waiting lists. So there is this huge kind of question mark, and we don't know the detail. We won't know until Liz Kendall stands up on her feet and tells everybody the detail. But there is this huge question mark, and I think this kind of internal dilemma about can you realise savings without investment? And that speaks to what Faisal's saying, as in, what is this really about for government? They'll argue it's about reform, but they do have to make savings too. And will their plan actually do that? Because previous attempts at this stuff have been really tricky, right? When people try to look at
they failed.
the sort of reform in the past, it's been really difficult.
So I have a question related to that, which is if, as some people contend, that one of the principal drivers of these increases has been policy, and has been the architecture of benefits, making it more attractive to do A but not do B, especially going into work, going supported into work. How would that explain something else you mention in your piece, which is a significant rise in the number of people reporting mental health conditions and, crucially, rises in deaths of despair, as they're categorised, which is to say suicide and deaths directly from alcohol and drugs. Doesn't the deaths of despair statistic suggest that there's something bigger going on above and beyond policy?
So I think there's no doubt that stats show that there's been a rise in mental ill health sort of since the pandemic, maybe just a couple of years before that. People speculate, is it the rise of smartphone use? Is it just or has something else happened? Has there been a lowering of the stigma? The stigma not just of saying that you're mentally ill, but also you're sufficiently mentally ill that you can't work as much or can't work at all. Certainly, I think it's just a fact to say that there are things for which benefits are claimed and for which people won't work, which weren't the case 10 or 20 years ago. Indeed, this is quite an important point. The entire architecture of the incapacity and disability benefit system from 30, 40 years ago was built upon physical issues, physical disabilities, factories, literally people kind of not having limbs and not being able to go into work. And so that is the sort of paradigm in which this begins. I think that there is an argument that as serious and as much as, there's talk of parity between mental ill health and physical ill health, as serious as that is, as mental health and debilitating as it can be, there's a spectrum. There's obviously more of a spectrum than there necessarily might be with a physical injury. And then maybe the pattern might be different too. Perhaps, it's a bit more sporadic in terms of when you might not be able to work. So these are all sorts of arguments being floated around, I think, to suggest, is it the right system? So is the medicine, if it were, in terms of this ill health work nexus, is it much more about sort of talking therapies and motivation and all that sort of stuff than it is about about what you would have had with physical disabilities? And there's added dimension, which is just the sheer youth of some of these people. I mean, I use this word advisedly, but looking at the stats and being sort of directed towards, people use the phrase, it's scary. It's scary to see young people going straight from education into working capacity based on mental ill health. It's obvious that having a profession, a job, is probably one of the best things you can do to deal with mental ill health. And so this is very, very difficult chicken and egg. And the one lesson we do have from years of data is once you're out of the labour market with ill health for 2 years, it's extremely difficult, extremely low probability of getting back in. That is one thing for somebody, and it's bad. Don't get me wrong, if you're in your 50s and 60s, it is horrific if you're in your 20s. And so that's why they are, quote unquote, scared.
There was a GP on the Today programme on Radio 4 who was making exactly that point on Monday morning. He was saying that the danger is the longer you're out of the labour market, the harder it is to get back in. And that is one of the real risks in this, which is why it will be fascinating to see what the government put forward in terms of its reforms. And there was this idea that was floated around in some of the Sunday newspapers about the right to try. So as in the right to try and to go into work without then having some sort of punitive impact on your payments or benefits, which is often cited or quoted or believed to be one of the barriers that stops people attempting to get into the workforce, is that they think they're going to then lose the support they're currently getting. That's a really off-putting thing. I think the kind of challenge for all of this with the government, when they're looking at which benefits and who that might affect and what bits of the welfare programme that they're trying to reform or cut, depending on what you believe the true motivation of government is. The one that we've talked a lot about is personal independence payments, which you referenced at the beginning, James, which are payments for people with long-term health or health problems or disabilities. And they are not means-tested payments, and they are not to do with how much you actually work. It is about the state giving you support with the extra costs that come as a consequence of your illness or disability. Now, we believe, we're told that they're not going to freeze that anymore, but they might still be looking at the eligibility around who can receive some of that. And I think this is where the real danger point comes, because in trying to amend, rework the system so you can support some people, particularly the younger working age people that Faisal talks about, where there is a real concern in government about the number of people in that bracket who are not in the labour market, do you there end up making life a whole lot harder for the people that really depend on that kind of benefit because they cannot work, And for those people, if you're talking about looking at the eligibility, looking at the way it's assessed, and we have heard this before when people have tried to look at this element of the welfare system, what you can end up doing is making things very much harder for the people that really do kind of rely on that. And that's the balance the government's trying to strike. And I think that's what's going to be quite tricky for them to get right.
Yeah, and the other aspect that you mentioned, Faisal, that you've talked about, which I thought jumped out at me from your piece that you've written as well, is you talked about there being more insecure 0 hours contracts in the UK than in some other nations. So with that in mind, there's obviously a role for employers here as well in terms of getting people back into the workplace, not just the state or just individuals, but also employers as well. I mean, is it possible that fragility of employment that you talk about there, combined with stagnating household incomes and period of high inflation and so on, has contributed to the rise in these health and welfare claims? And I suppose that the question that follows from that is, isn't this a catch-22 for business? Because on the one hand, you might say, that flexible labour market is harming employees, is preventing people from coming into the labour market. But on the other hand, what you're saying is that you actually, at the same time, are trying to make the labour market less flexible by, the government has all sorts of arguments why it's bringing in, it says improved rights for workers. But aren't these two things sort of tugging at each other in different directions, and businesses in the middle? I mean, basically, the contention from some business, is it not, is that the Labour government is making it harder to employ people, and that will, at a time when they're saying also you need to employ more people and people who need a lot more help.
A couple of things. I think that is a great example of where you think about all the crises in modern British politics. We need to hear from people at the centre of all of this about how they feel. If the insecurity of job contracts is contributing, a modern life of housing outcomes, or is this what this is? Often incapacity roles are actually a proxy for hidden unemployment. Is there something else going on that's underlying this? It seems to me such a multifaceted crisis that, I can't imagine, I know there's a joke about inquiries and stuff, I can't imagine a bigger thing you'd want to get to the bottom of this with as many voices as possible.
Because nobody's really come up with a sort of accepted conclusion,
and the statistics, they are buried in numbers at the DWP. They have amazingly interesting statistics. They break it down by postcode. One of the theories is it's basically hidden unemployment or underemployment, and you can see that it correlates with those areas where that actual statistic is high by postcode. Is it about education? This is particularly acute for people with lower levels education. But the particular reference that I made in the piece about businesses was in reference to the fact that the Dutch succeeded in getting this down over the past 20 years with a set of reforms that were tough. I think they limited eligibility blankets for under 45s, for example. That would be extremely brutal. For example, if they announced that tomorrow, I don't think they are going to, but that's what the Dutch did. They just decided, I don't know, this is for the over 45s. But they got businesses to pay. They got businesses to pay the cost. And the point is, if you have a naturally more insecure relationship with your worker, you won't feel the incentive to invest in an employee who has a sort of mild mental health condition that you probably manage with certain types of help. And so there is a problem there. And then on top of that, you're asking businesses who you have just increased the national insurance for, who you've also, asked to deal with increased working rights as a result of the New Deal for working people. You're asking them to do something much more. Now, to be clear, a number of private sector employers tell us that they're dealing with this quite naturally, that they're changing the way that a job functions right now. So they're just having to do this in order to get the staff in. But I think the point is that the nature of labour relations and the jobs market in the UK is a bit different. But the Dutch example does hold out some interesting avenues for exploration.
Wonder if Liz Kendall's been looking at that. We will find out. We will find out because we're going to see what they come up with, whether Liz Kendall's gone Dutch.
And yeah, very good. And then we'll find out what the politics is as well, and whether the Prime Minister and his cabinet, or indeed whether he has the support of his cabinet. I was going to say whether the Prime Minister or the cabinet has the support of the Labour Party, but actually it's a question of whether everyone in cabinet are on board with this as well. So that is for Tuesday. But Faisal, for now, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that is two stories which are likely to really dominate this week. And if you've got any questions about any of them, anything you want to know, get in touch, drop us an email. It is newscast@bbc.co.uk. We would love to hear from you. But that is it for this episode of Newscast.
It is. We'll speak to you very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.